Yes, Mr. Hill.
Dr. Snape, I've been asked to pick up with you something that you said about the cleaning processes at B25, the old BPL building. I think you described them as very difficult to implement because of the structure of that building. Is that right?
Now, we've lost your sound, I'm afraid. Dr. Snape. Still, there's no sound coming through here.
Anything now?
That's better. Good.
Yes.
Do you want to ask the question again, and we'll start back again?
Okay.
Dr. Snape, it concerns what you said about the cleaning processes at the old BPL. I think it was along the lines of them being very difficult to implement because of the structure of the building. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little, please.
Yes. It was a combination of the building structure, but perhaps even more important, the finishes of the rooms. In the new facility, we deliberately designed in floors that were continuous resin floors that were very easy to clean, and coving from the floor to the walls so that it was possible. There were no corners that couldn't be cleaned. In the old building, that simply was not the case. It had been built as an immediate post-war adaptation, and none of that was a consideration.
One risk that results from that is of, as you said, contamination from microbacterial elements into the product. Was that an issue that caused particular problems from products sent out from the old BPL?
It was not an issue that caused particular problems. It was an issue that caused us great concern to make sure that we didn't have problems. When bacteria grow, they produce biochemical material called endotoxin that can cause fever. We had to work very hard to maintain low levels of endotoxin, of fever-producing substances, in order to avoid that being a problem.
Does it follow that the efforts and resource that were put into that took away from the efforts and resource that could be put into producing the products that you were supposed to be producing?
In some ways, yes. I mean, a good example would be even in the new factory, you saw the teardown machine, the plasma teardown machine. For a process like that, which takes 5 to 6 hours, at the scale we were running it, you have to interrupt the process probably every hour and a half or 2 hours in order to do an automated clean of the line and then restart. In building 25, there were many more situations in which we simply had to, batch size was constrained by, as much as anything else, the need to limit the introduction and proliferation of microbial contamination.
A second point that I've been asked to raise with you about the cleaning facilities within B25 is the possibility that plasma from one pool may have remained on a surface and been included into a second pool. Was that a concern that you had or that you can recall?
It's not a concern that we allowed to become reality. The cleaning procedures for vessels in particular and for pipelines were sufficiently rigorous that we could convince ourselves that we were managing that. You can't eliminate it as a risk, but you can manage the risk, and that's what we did.
I'd like to turn now then, please, to your previous evidence. I'm just going to go through it, and at points I'll stop and ask you one or two questions. It's right, isn't it, that you were part of a group of figures from BPL who went to give evidence at the House of Commons Social Service Committee on the 25th of March 1987?
That's correct.
The reference for that, sir, so that we have it for the transcript, is LDOW 40247. Did you also provide a draft proof of evidence for the HIV litigation at the end of the 90s? Sorry, at the end of the 80s.
I was provided with what I've always assumed was a lawyer's pro forma for me to build on. The fact is that that was overtaken by events with the resolution of the litigation. So it didn't progress very much beyond the lawyer's pro forma.
Just so we have a reference, it's CBLA 5072_032. Just on that point, did you have any concerns about the way in which they went about seeking your evidence?
No. In that kind of situation, it was good to see what they expected me to cover. Had it progressed beyond that, I would have corrected things. For example, one thing that sticks in my mind, there's a reference to me not as having a PhD, but being a physician or being medically qualified. I would have corrected that, for example. I didn't feel that I was being pushed in any particular direction, except the direction to manage the production of product and out of BPL.
Did you have any further role in the litigation, for example, in the discovery of documents process?
I don't believe that I did, though people working in the control unit under me would have and did supply information if Richard Lane requested it, or perhaps Jim Smith requested it.
Could I go, please, Solly, to PRSE 303122? This is the next piece of evidence that I'd like to ask you about. It's what you refer to in your witness statement as chronology 1. If we could have page 2 of that document, first of all, please. Can you see that on screen, Dr. Snape?
I can. Yes, thank you.
I'm not going to go to any of the entries now, so we needn't expand it too much. But is it right that you prepared this chronology yourself, taking it from the litigation files that Clifford Chance had generated as part of the HIV litigation?
It is.
Why did you do that?
I guess because I'm a creature of habit. I've always found chronologies served me well, and I wanted to make sure that I think the better prepared before there's a need, in anticipation of a need. I prepared it so that I would have a chronological summary, and I would be able to provide to colleagues a chronological summary.
Do you know when you prepared it?
It would have been probably 1997. At the bottom of that page, there is a date, but I think that's a print date, not a preparation date.
The date at the bottom of the page is the 23rd of August 1999.
That's correct.
But you, as you say, sorry, go on.
That's almost certainly the print date for that particular version.
Was there anything that prompted you to set about creating the chronology?
Not really. I had the opportunity, I had access to the files that remained at BPL after Richard Lane retired, and I wanted to make sure that I took full advantage of that. It's probably, I'm sure at some point, I don't know if it's documented, but Richard Walker, who was the then chief executive of BPL, asked me to make sure that there was a chronological summary that could be resorted to if it were required.
If we could just turn to page 1 of that document, please, Sully. We can see that this is a fax cover sheet, and it is sent from BPL to Dr. Bob Perry. And
Yep.
It's sent by Rita Wadley on the 26th, sorry, it's signed by Rita Wadley, dated the 26th of August 1999, and it is stated to be from you. Do you know why you were sending this document to Dr. Perry in August 1999?
I don't recall. Rita Wadley was my secretary, and it's more than likely that Bob Perry and I met probably at one of the meetings when we were looking at development of I can't remember, but I suspect I might even have told Bob that I was intending to retire and mentioned that I'd made the chronology, and I'm sure he probably said, would you mind letting me have a copy? And I asked Rita to let him have it.
You have also provided the inquiry with 2 further chronologies. These are at WITN 3431006 and WITN 3431007. And is it right that they primarily concern the chronology around VCJD?
That's correct.
You say in your statement that you created the first of those chronologies in the late 1990s and the second in about 2001. Is that right?
Yes, very. I mean, the first one was probably 98. The second one would have been end of 2000, beginning of 2001.
You gave evidence to the Lindsay inquiry in Ireland in July 2001. We have the transcript of that at LIND 40311 for the record, and a draft of your statement at WITN 3431002. I say a draft because we have it in Word form. To the best of your knowledge, is that a final draft of your statement?
I'm not seeing anything on the screen.
If we could bring that up, please, Sully. WITN 3431002. WITN 3431002, please.
Why do we have the 301 at the end, underscore 301? We don't need that, do we?
This is a different statement, sir. This is to the Lindsay Tribunal. Well,
There we are, thank you.
We have it. Thank you, Sully. As you can see, it is a document in Word form with some track changes still available. Are you able to assist about whether or not this was a final draft or a near final draft of your written evidence to Lindsay?
Yes, I've certainly seen that. I believe it was a near final draft.
I'd like to ask you about a document that we saw last week, WITN 3431004. The first page of this document is on screen for you now. I won't take you through it in detail because it's an email exchange between Dr. Robert Perry and Dr. Peter Foster that I believe that you have seen before and that we referred to last week. And I'm not going to ask you about Dr. Perry's views or Dr. Foster's views, but in short, it is a discussion about whether or not Dr. Perry should discuss with you the evidence that you were going to give to the Lindsay Tribunal. If we could go to page 2 of the document, please. I understand that you were contacted by a journalist about this document, and in an email in reply to the journalist, you wrote this. Thank you for your call this morning and for the associated email thread, which I have now reviewed. I understand that the email thread was disclosed following a recent Freedom of Information search and that you were considering writing an article based on the email content. A pedestrian response to your inquiry, if I may, hopefully satisfying your questions. And you confirm that you are the Terry Snape referred to in the email, and you also go through your position and that of Dr. Foster and Dr. Perry. You say at the fourth of the sub-bullet points, our respective responsibilities meant that Bob Perry and I regularly worked together in a range of regulatory and quality fora as individual experts and as representatives of our different organisations. I had fewer, less regular contacts with Peter Foster. You then confirm that the tribunal referred to in the emails was the Lindsay Tribunal, and you say this, and I quote, to the best of my recollection, I was never approached by Bob Perry or anyone else from SNBTS with a request to share the witness statement that I had prepared for the tribunal. I was certainly never put under pressure by anyone to review or modify my witness statement in any way or to tailor the evidence that I was due to give at the tribunal. That email was sent on the 7th of May 2019. Does that email reflect your current position about whether you were approached by Dr. Perry and about whether you came under any pressure about your evidence to Lindsay?
It does.
You say in your statement that you were given access to the files at BPL in order to help prepare your statement for the Lindsay Tribunal. Is it right, though, that when you gave your evidence, you gave it as an individual and not as a representative of BPL or the Department of Health?
That's correct.
You were also approached a little later to assist with a Department of Health paper on self-sufficiency. If we could just look at what you say in your witness statement about that. If we could go, Solly, please, to WITN 3431001. If we could have page 12, paragraph 29, please. You say this in your statement. On one other occasion, after my retirement from BPL, I was granted access to BPL papers by authority of a then BPL Chief Executive, Mr. Chris Hadfield, to provide guidance to the Department of Health, Peter Bergin, on matters relating to self-sufficiency. I was approached initially by Charles Lister, Department of Health, around August 2001, and later in November 2002 by Peter Bergin. The outcome of these interactions was the Department of Health paper, Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products in England and Wales, a chronology from 1973 to 1991. I had no role in drafting the paper.
We've lost that on the screen.
Sorry, if we go over to the next page. My fault, I went ahead too quickly. I had no role in drafting the paper. My only contribution was to provide pointers to documentation that I knew existed at BPL, and later, in May 2005, to check a draft for factual accuracy in respect of information that I had provided. I understand that this paper has since been withdrawn as unreliable. I have no knowledge of the basis of the concerns expressed by critics. Does that summarise accurately your involvement with that Department of Health paper?
It does, yes.
If we could go, please, Solly, to WITN 3431005 and page 3 of that document. We can see that this is a letter to you from the Department of Health, and particularly from William Connon in the Department of Health, sent in May 2005, entitled Review of Papers, Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products. And it says in the first paragraph, as you know, in 2002, ministers commissioned a review of papers on the issue of self-sufficiency in blood products during the 1970s and 1980s. The letter then attached a draft copy of the report, and it also mentions the conversations that you had with Peter Bergin in August 2002, and the fact that where he describes it is that you were interviewed by Peter Bergin. In the final paragraph, Mr. Connon states, I should be grateful if you could let me have any comments you may have on the factual accuracy of the report. It would be helpful to have any comments you have by the 10th of June, if possible. So this letter sent on the 27th of May 2005, some 3 years after your initial involvement in the project, asking for comments within 2 weeks. Do you remember if you made any comments to the Department of Health?
I made verbal comments. I'm pretty sure I didn't send written comments, or at least if I did, I don't have a copy of any kind of written exchange, either paper or email.
And is it right to understand that your comments were on those matters that you had assisted the Department of Health with, rather than on the paper itself as a whole?
Absolutely. I didn't feel qualified to stray beyond the data that I hadn't even provided data. I'd pointed them to places where they could find data if they wanted to.
Thank you. That's all I'm going to ask for now about your previous evidence. We may come to some of those documents in due course. If we could go back to the roles that you held and the times at which you held them. Your first role between 1970 and 1975 was as scientist in charge of production at PFL in Oxford. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you go there directly from your undergraduate degree?
I did.
You were also studying for your PhD at the time, is that correct?
No, well, I had a grant previously with my supervisor at in the physical chemistry lab at Oxford, but I gave up that grant in order to take the job at PFL. I had a loose understanding with Ethel Bidwell that I would recommence a PhD, a London PhD, rather than an Oxford DPhil. The Lister Institute was a school of the University of London, and it was infinitely less expensive to go down that route than down the Oxford DPhil route.
Dr. Bidwell, who you mentioned there, she was the head of the PFL at the time, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
What did your role involve between 1970 and 1975?
It was the title makes it sound grander than it was. Basically, I had a small pilot plant laboratory. I think I had 7 technicians, no scientists. The technicians were all on day release, so 1 or 2 of them would be absent each day. I functioned when they weren't there, and that was probably 4 days out of 5 as a technician myself. My week began on Sunday in the afternoon, putting out 13 bags of plasma in the cold room, ready for processing on Monday morning. On Monday, that plasma was thawed. At that time, we were making the Blombach Factor 8. We went through the Blombach fractionation process. My title was scientist in charge. I was effectively a technical person leading a team of technicians. I was expected to develop alongside that work. The intention was that I would develop improved factor 8 concentrates, and my process development took the form of initially starting with the Johnson process that had been published at the time, beginning the establishment of that at PFL, and then seeking to improve it to a high purity product. It became quite obvious to me in that time that a significant limitation was having to rely on the good offices of the Haemophilia Centre assay laboratory to do assays, a large number of assays that they were not in a position to do, and to undertake tests on in-process samples. Hence the switch in 1975.
That was a switch to being scientist in charge of quality control at PFL. How did your role change?
Quite significantly. Jim Smith, who had been working at Protein Fractionation Centre in Liberton, came down to take on the production and product development role at PFL, and I was given a very appealing responsibility of setting up an assay laboratory and developing assay methods that were more suitable to supporting a pilot plant and production. And Jim and I worked in harness for the next 6-7 years in that way.
The title includes the words quality control. What did those words mean at that time, the mid-70s, early 80s?
Initially, it was focused entirely on coagulation factor assays. It then, and that was to be the subject of my, by then registered London PhD. But it quickly developed into quality control in the sense of putting together an environmental monitoring program, putting together a small team, a clerk who would recover data from the haemophilia centre where the products that we made were being used, and particularly focusing on things like any side effects, including what at that stage we were starting to call non-A, non-B hepatitis, for review and discussion with the haemophilia centre directors and the hepatitis working party. It also involved setting up procedures for improving the documentation at PFL, the process documentation, and setting up more formal batch release procedures for the batches being manufactured.
Between September 1981 and January 1982, you were the head of laboratory at PFL, following on from Dr. Bidwell's retirement. What did that role entail?
Grand title, very little difference in function. Jim and I joked about the role. When he was there, he functioned as head of lab. When I was there, I functioned as head of lab. We effectively played cox and box with a small Portakabin office and made it work.
That was a relatively short arrangement, because in February 1982 you became the head of quality control for both BPL and PFL. First of all, did that involve you moving your day-to-day work activities mainly to Elstree, save for that one day a week or so that you mentioned earlier that was spent in Oxford?
Yes, I made a commute from East Oxford to, nearer the Chilterns, to BPL 4 days a week.
Initially, you reported to the Deputy Director Administration, Mr. Gilbert Mallory, is that right?
That's correct.
What did the role of Head of Quality Control for BPL and PFL involve?
My role at PFL didn't really change, except that it had to be done in a more hands-off way. My role at BPL was quite different. BPL had six independent QC laboratories, established QC laboratories. My role was to help them work together, to give them a common purpose in terms of how they functioned in quality control, and to spend time in production at BPL, reviewing operating procedures, reviewing facilities, and initiating such changes as needed to happen. The classic self-inspection role in the factory.
We heard, or have heard over the last couple of weeks, that one of the criticisms made by the Medicines Inspectorate was the absence of employees at BPL in various roles, including in respect of quality control and quality assurance. Was your appointment a response to the Medicines Inspectorate report, do you know?
I'm sure that was one of the drivers. It was certainly something that Richard Lane was determined to see happened, along with the other appointments that he was seeking, the production lead, which Gilbert Mallory took on, and lack of an engineering manager with appropriate experience. So those three, I think, progressed out of the report. Gilbert Mallory's post was the first to be filled, then mine, and then an engineer, Ian Ling, joined us.
Your job was restyled in 1987 as the head of quality assurance and control, and you thereafter reported to Dr. Lane. Was there any material change in the role that you were undertaking at that time?
The reason for the change, we'd had a Hay MSL review of staffing. For me, a significant material change was that my salary was intended to have a ceiling lifted. In terms of what I did, it was still Gilbert Mallory who was responsible for aspects, by then, the commissioning of the new BPL, the Building 27. My role was to continue with both the managing the quality control laboratory, but also a lot of focus on batch review and batch release, because from 1982 onwards, I was the qualified person, typically one of two qualified persons, reviewing and releasing batches for clinical use.
A qualified person, as I understand it, is a position that is put in place either by law or by regulations to ensure that there is somebody who has the responsibility for batch release. Was it a role that required you to undertake any further training or any formal study or examination?
Not at the time, but it was the purpose of the QP, qualified person, is the last stop between the organisation making a product and the patient. And in situations in which, for example, a production manager, and I'm not saying this happened at BPL, but situations in which a production manager took the view that something was right, the QP's role is to take a different view that says, well, it may be right for the business, but it might not be right for the patient. And if necessary, to interdict release of product. And in the final analysis, if necessary, take up the issue with what was then the Medicines Control Agency to make sure that the right decision was taken.
Is there, just going back to your job title, Head of Quality Assurance and Control, could you just explain the distinction between those two terms for the inquiry? Quality assurance on the one hand and quality control on the other.
Imagine a balloon, and the external envelope of the balloon is quality assurance. Within that balloon, there is GMP, good manufacturing practice. Also within that balloon, there is quality control, which undertakes a review of what's actually happening in process, typically makes the process documentation appropriate, and undertakes review of the product output from that process. So quality assurance was an umbrella. Quality control was the engine that both did testing, but also batch review and release, and promoted self-inspection and internal audit.
From 1988 to 1991, you undertook a role that was at first referred to as the Therapeutics Manufacturing Manager, later referred to as the Factory Manager. Could you just describe briefly your role there, please?
It was a restructuring. The first thing, it happened as a result of the departure of Gilbert Mallory. Commissioning of Building 27, the new factory, was not complete at that time, so an important part of it was to manage the transfer of products from Building 25 to Building 27, and as part of that, to undertake some other activities, for example, converting from a multi-union site to a single union site, to make our operation more efficient, and to introduce first two-shift operation and then three-shift operation in a plant that was designed with three-shift operation in mind. I'm in danger of losing my thread. I had by then reporting to me two individuals, someone responsible for production, a production manager, and by then I had a QA, a head of quality control, David Donald, who took on the role that I previously had. David Donald was a QP, as I was a QP. He had batch release authority across all of BPL's products. There were one or two products where I had specific expertise and I retained a QP authority in those. I did not perform as production manager anymore. I allowed myself to be convinced that it was a proper separation of production or quality control from production. I had overall responsibility for both, but I had individuals reporting to me for each of them. And I wasn't unhappy to be able to persuade the organization 3 years later to let me focus on one of those two activities, the QA/QC role, and for them to bring in a production director who would take on the management of production role.
You say that change took place 3 years later. Is that when you became the technical director in 1991, the role that you remained in until 2000?
Yeah, technical director. The technical director title embraced QA, QC, and regulatory affairs, and I felt it was a better and more appropriate separation of quality assurance and quality control from production than had existed in the previous 3 years.
It follows from what you have said that your career developed entirely through PFL and BPL, state-run institutions, rather than through private pharmaceutical companies. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Was that also the case for Dr. Smith?
No, was it the case? I believe that Jim had a research position before he joined the SNBTS under Dr. Cummings, but I don't believe Jim had any industrial or big pharma. I know he didn't have that kind of experience any more than I did.
Is that also the same for Dr. Lane, the director of BPL?
No, I mean Richard certainly had. First of all, he was medically qualified. He had worked for some time in the blood transfusion service. I cannot remember what his specific roles were before the blood service, except that I think one of those roles was in the US, but again in a research capacity, not a manufacturing capacity.
I should have been clearer in my question, I'm sorry. What I meant was Dr. Lane didn't have any great experience in large-scale industrial manufacturing of pharmaceutical products.
No.
David Donald, who you mentioned there, who came in as head of quality control, is he somebody who was taken from the private sector?
Yes. And that was very specifically my target when I was seeking to recruit to that post, because I recognized that I didn't have, and as far as I knew, no one on BPL staff had external manufacturing experience. I was looking for two people. I wanted a quality control manager. I also wanted an experienced process microbiologist, because it's much easier to influence the process for the good as a microbiologist if you work in the factory, not in a laboratory with test tubes and petri dishes. So I managed to recruit to those posts, both of them in 1985.
I'm just going to ask you a few things about what the roles that you undertook did not entail. And I take these from your witness statement. First of all, you say at paragraph 11, that you didn't have a role in redesigning BPL and the design of B27. That was Mr. Mallory. Is that right?
It's correct, and it was made very clear to me that that was the case.
Do you think that you should have had more of a role in B27 and the design of B27, given your expertise at that time as head of quality control?
Not necessarily given my expertise in quality control, but my expertise in plasma fractionation, I believe, would have allowed me to make useful contributions. But the view was taken very specifically by Gilbert Mallory and supported at the time by Richard Lane that there was enough to do managing quality in Building 25 and reviewing and undertaking the QP function for products from Building 25, that I should stay hands-off factory design.
You said paragraph 17 of your witness statement that you had no responsibility at any time for administrative functions, for marketing, for research and development at BPL. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also said that you didn't have any responsibility for medical at BPL. What does medical mean in that context?
Richard Lane's role at BPL was styled director, but in an organisation like BPL, making products for aseptic products for treatment of patients, for injection and infusion into patients, it's logical to have, if not a medical department, at least someone who can contribute to, and if necessary, make judgments with a medical background. Richard Lane had always, in the time that I was at BPL, undertaken that role. It became more sensible, I guess, as time went on, for him not to be supported in that role with a small medical department that could receive complaints, patient complaints, make contributions to things like patient insert leaflets, and change or influence the thinking around what products BPL should and shouldn't make.
But that was not your role, as I understand your statement.
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I had a contribution to it, but not as a physician, not as a medically qualified person.
Did you have any role in organising clinical trials of products from BPL?
No, by the time I had a supporting role in the sense of providing analytical data to such a trial, but the responsibility for liaison with clinical trial centres, for example, the products manufactured at 8Y or 9A, was through Jim Smith, very much in liaison with Charlie Ritzer at the Haemophilia Centre. Bearing in mind that the two places were within the same building, and Dr. Ritzer's office was 20 yards up the corridor from Jim Smith's office.
If I could just read you another section of your witness statement. I don't ask for it to be brought up, it's only short. It's from paragraph 41. You say, and I quote, "I never enjoyed personal involvement in policy making for BPL, PFL. This was very much the province of the Department of Health and agencies operating with the Department of Health. Although in later years I shared responsibility for implementation of policy with other members of the BPL executive team." Could I just ask you to expand on what you meant by that, please?
Yes. The policy construction, policy direction at BPL until relatively late in, probably from the time I moved to BPL in 82, was initially through Richard Lane. And Richard Lane relating upwards to the Department of Health. Then, of course, with the formation of the CBLA and the appointment of a CBLA chief executive, policy developed through that line as well. My role was to make input in executive committee meetings with other people, so with Bernard Crowley as chief executive, Richard Lane as director of BPL, finance officer, production director. We had a regular executive meeting, which, if any organisation within BPL constructed policy, it was that. In fact, policy was more often visited down from the Department of Health and then interpreted and implemented at the highest level by CBLA and then by people like myself and the other directors.
Thank you. We have a list of committees that you sat on as an independent expert at paragraph 18 of your witness statement. I won't take you through those, but one of those committees was the biological subcommittee of the Committee of the Safety of Medicine. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you sit there wearing a BPL hat, as it were, or as an independent scientist?
It was always very clear, both from the chairman of CSM and from BPL, that I was there as an individual with a background that may be suitable as a member of biological subcommittee. I was specifically instructed not to bring CSM papers into BPL or CSM matters into BPL. I received the papers at home by Blue Bag. I was provided with a filing cabinet by BPL so that I didn't have to think of bringing things into BPL. And when I went to a CSMB meeting, I expressed my opinion and then I handed back the Blue Bag with the documents that have been supplied for my review to the Secretariat of CSMB.
I'd like to move on now to the products that were developed at BPL and PFL. I hope to do this relatively quickly, a whistle-stop tour through the products. If we could go, please, to WITN 3431001. This is from your witness statement to this inquiry, in paragraph 86, please. Dr. Snape, I'm not going to ask you for technical detail, but just an overview of the products that were developed in the 1970s and the 1980s in particular. Yes, sorry, it's page 31, paragraph 86. What you wrote is this. Initially, the process used for factor VIII manufacture at PFL and BPL was a method developed in Sweden by Blombach in 1958. We worked with plasma batch sizes of up to 70 litres, recovering albumin and immunoglobulins, as well as factor VIII. If we just pause there, you mentioned the Blombach process earlier, and we have looked at the schematic showing how the fractionation developed. The batch size that you give there of 70 litres, is that the smallest batch size that you can remember working with at PFL and BPL?
It's not the smallest batch size I worked with at PFL. It's probably the smallest batch size at BPL. It wouldn't have been 13. We typically process 13 5-litre packs. So, if you like, 65 to 70 litres would be the best description. But worth making the point while that paragraph's there, that because we were recovering albumin and immunoglobulin as well as factor VIII and factor IX, because that came out as well, we could only process one batch a week. The process takes essentially 6 days. one of the most significant changes in 1975 when Jim Smith began to work at BPL was we agreed that it was possible to ship supernatant from the factor 8 and factor 9 processing back to Elstree for them to process albumin and immunoglobulin, those supernatants to albumin and immunoglobulins, which created more time to produce more batches of factor 8 and factor 9.
You said that 70 litres wasn't the smallest volume that you worked with at PFL. What was the smallest pool size that you worked with at PFL?
For routine manufacture of factor 8, it would have been 65 to 70. But in my pilot plant, my first 5 years, developing or seeking to develop Johnson product and high purity Johnson product, I would have worked with much less, maybe 15, 20 litres of plasma.
Should we understand that was a part of experimental work, as you say, to try to develop a new product rather than producing product for use by patients?
Absolutely.
As a rough rule of thumb, should we take it that about 5 donations goes into 1 litre, if we assume 200 millilitres of plasma obtained from a donation?
Yes, that 5 donations was the derivation of my 200 milliliter donation. If I'd been more on the ball when I was doing my first draft of my witness statement, I would probably have fallen back on Harold Gunson's 180 milliliters. But yeah, 5 donations to a litre.
70 litres.
For plasma before SAG-M and not apheresis, recovered plasma.
We'll come on to that difference a little later when we look at pool sizes in more detail. But 65 to 70 kilograms, by my maths, if we take the simpler sum of 5, will be about 325 to 350 donations. Is that right?
That's correct.
I won't try to calculate the sum using 180 millilitres, at least at the moment.
No.
If we could return to the statement, paragraph 87, please. The factor 8 produced using the Blombach method had very low specific activity, i.e. it was not very pure. Then you give a description of specific activity, which I needn't trouble you with because we've talked about that already. You go on to say, the main protein constituents of the final product were fibrinogen and fibronectin. Factor 8 was a trace protein. This composition meant that the freeze-dried product was extremely reluctant to redissolve. Because of this, and because the volume to be injected for a typical therapeutic dose was quite large, greater than 100 millilitres, the product was unsuitable for home therapy. It could only be administered in the haemophilia centre. In January 1974, I visited Dr. Alan Johnson in New York to better understand an improved factor 8 process he had developed. And by the end of 1970...
Can you roll the page?
Sorry, if we could go down to paragraph 88. Thank you. Sorry, I hadn't spotted that. In January 1974, I visited Dr. Alan Johnson in New York to better understand an improved factor 8 process he had developed. And by the end of 1975, PFL had switched from the Blombach process for factor 8 manufacture to, if we could go over to the page, please, the process developed by Alan Johnson. For 4 years after that, until 1978 to 79, factor 8 was produced at PFL using the Johnson method of production. PFL's early product was initially designated 8IP, IP signifying intermediate purity. Later, after improvements to the method to reduce the content of fibrinogen and fibronectin, the designation became 8CRV, CRV signifying cooled reduce volume. If we could just pause there for a moment. So that is a description of what was happening at PFL. Did BPL adopt the Johnson process in or around 1975 as well?
Yes.
Their product, as I understand it, was designated 8HL. Is that right?
That's correct. I don't know why.
So we should understand 8CRV, the Oxford product, and 8HL, the BPL product, to be equivalent intermediate purity products, but not identical.
Not identical because they were made in different facilities by different people. It's worth just mentioning that it's easy to see that as a simple switch from Blomback to the Johnson product. It's a big switch because the Blomback product was in a half-litre bottle. It had to be shell frozen around the side of the bottle, and reconstituting it, if there are any patients watching who've ever reconstituted Blomback Factor 8, it was a little bit like trying to dissolve polystyrene. It floated rather than dissolved. So it was a significant change.
It resulted in a product, you say in paragraph 90, that was much easier to dissolve, had a greater potency, and so was easier for patients to use. Is that a fair summary?
It is.
You also say in that paragraph that factor 8 yield by Blomback was about 20%, whereas about 25 to 30% was yielded by the Johnson process. Again, is that a fair summary?
Probably the yields quoted for the Johnson process that I've used for the Johnson process there are probably optimistic. 25% would be nearer to the mark.
You mentioned the tweak to the Johnson process that took place, leading to the designation of 8CRV. You say in paragraph 92 that took place in about 1978 to 1979. To the best of your memory, is that about right?
Yes, but you're challenging my memory now.
Should we understand that those two products, 8HL and 8CRV, were the main factor 8 concentrates produced by PFL and BPL until the introduction of heat treatment in the mid-80s?
Certainly the main, I would say, the only products made, factor 8 products made.
In terms of factor 9, you mentioned this earlier, that there was a product that had been developed by, I think it was 1975, according to your statement, that was known as 9D, which contained factors 2, 9, and 10. Is that right?
That's correct.
But
there was a factor 9 concentrate before that, type C factor 9, which was a 4-factor concentrate.
The difference between type C and 9D was 9D was a 3-factor concentrate, and a dedicated factor 7 concentrate, 7D, was produced alongside it.
That's correct.
9D, was that the main or only factor 9 product produced by PFL and BPL until the introduction of heat treatment?
Yes. Once we had a factor 7 concentrate, independent factor 7 concentrate available, we could cease production of the 4-factor 2, 7, 9, 10 type C concentrate, and we were happy to do that.
Just to complete the picture, when heat treatment was introduced, we will come to this in a little more detail later, but the principal product that was the result of heat treatment was, for factor 8, was 8Y, heat treated at 80 degrees for 72 hours, and the equivalent factor 9 product treated again for 80 degrees 72 hours was 9A. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I've come to the end of that section. I wonder if now might be an opportune time for lunch.
Well, yes, it would. We'll come back at 2:05. So 2:05.
Thank you, sir.